The Writer's Stage, Lesson 14, Rhetorical Strategies. In this lesson, we will consider language by continuing our study of tropes, figures of speech, and sentence patterns that we began in the earlier units. The ones chosen for this unit connect in some way to the age of the soldier and persuasive writing. Choosing our rhetorical devices carefully allows us to emphasize what we want and give greater force to our arguments. Let's look at the first rhetorical device, anaphora. Anaphora is the repetition of the first word or phrase in a series of clauses or sentences. And generally, you'll find that repetition at the beginning of each phrase or clause. Why would we want to do this? Why would we want to be repetitious? Well, first of all, for emphasis, even to create a sort of cadence or a rhythmic effect to our writing. For anaphora to create an increasingly powerful effect, the most important element in that series of repeated items would come last. So, using anaphora also helps with organization. Several examples of anaphora are found in John Danforth's persuasive speech studied in Lesson 12. Listen to the following passage. I grew up during one of the great periods of patriotism. I grew up during the Second World War. I grew up to recite the Pledge of Allegiance and to respect the flag. The repetition of I grew up emphasizes Danforth's patriotic upbringing. But no one provides better examples of anaphora than Martin Luther King Jr. The example here comes from his most famous speech, I Have a Dream. They call it the I Have a Dream speech. That wasn't the original name. And it was given 50 years ago, August of 1963. He gave this speech in the March on Washington. I won't read it to you because I certainly would not do it justice, but you can see the repetition of the phrase, I have a dream, and understand its effect. In fact, if you study this piece of the I Have a Dream speech, you'll see that the very last line ends with the greatest idea. And basically he's calling for it will be heaven on earth when peace comes to this world. The next rhetorical device is hyperbole. It's worth studying and seems appropriate for this unit because it calls attention to the soldier who sometimes exaggerates a boast. Simply stated, hyperbole is overstatement or deliberate exaggeration. Why would anyone deliberately exaggerate a position? It's often used for effect. We use hyperbole when ordinary terms simply would not convey the magnitude that we feel the situation requires. But a caution, overuse can cause issues with trust and erode the ethos or the ethical appeal of the writer. What do we do when someone repeatedly exaggerates a claim? We tend to ignore him. Think of the boy who cried wolf. Some equate overuse with the exclamation point in writing. We simply stop seeing that exclamation point. One other caution for hyperbole is the use of cliches. Try to avoid them. I am strong as a horse is a cliche. It also happens to be a simile, and it also happens to be hyperbole. But certainly you could come up with a more original way to describe your strength. Here are some examples of hyperbole. As you can imagine, hyperbole is often found in love songs and poems. Here is a piece from W.H. Audin's poem, As I Walked One Evening. Here he exclaims his love, and he says, I'll love you, dear, I'll love you, till China and Africa meet, and the river jumps over the mountain, and the salmon sing in the street. More modern songs often contain hyperbole as well, as Eminem shows us in his line from his song, Not Afraid. He sings, he was married to the game. Obviously that's an exaggeration, but we also know how much he loves it. And then finally, sometimes hyperbole is used as a humorous effect, as shown by Dave Barry from his essay Revenge of the Pork Person. He wrote, "A man can have a belly you could house commercial aircraft in. Plus, this man can have BO to the point where he interferes with radio transmissions, and he will still be convinced that in terms of attractiveness, he is borderline Don Johnson." Obviously, this is an exaggerated claim, and hopefully you know who Don Johnson is. It also sort of gives you an indication of when Dave Barry wrote this passage. But Don Johnson at the time was considered a stud. Litotes is the opposite of hyperbole. Litotes applies to the age of the soldier because oftentimes the soldier gives a calculated understatement of the danger. Litotes then is understatement. Understatement creates emphasis by saying less than would normally be expected. It downplays the situation. Understatement can also reduce tension by adding humor. Litotes, too, requires a bit of caution. You don't want to appear unconcerned by always downplaying a situation. Here are two examples from literature. The first is from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo's friend, who provides comic relief in the play, has just been stabbed by Tybalt, Romeo's enemy. Benvolio, another of their friends, asks, "What, art thou hurt?" And Mercutio comments, "Aye, a scratch, a scratch. Marry, 'tis enough. Where's my page? Go, villain, fetch a surgeon." They actually have no idea how badly hurt Mercutio is because he has understated his position. And unfortunately, shortly thereafter, he dies. My second example is from my all-time favorite series, Harry Potter. Moaning Myrtle is also a bit of comic relief, just like Mercutio. She's the spirit that haunts the girls' room of Hogwarts. When we first meet Moaning Myrtle in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, she introduces herself. She obviously lacks self-esteem, and she's sort of an Eeyore-type character. "Ah, Moaning Myrtle," she says, "I wouldn't expect you to know me. Who would ever want to talk about ugly, miserable, moping, moaning Myrtle? Ah!" And then she cries. Hermione turns to her friends and, in an attempt to explain, says, "She's a little sensitive." Quite an understatement, as Moaning Myrtle is the ultimate spiritual drama queen. As introduced in the unit on adolescence, there are several basic sentence patterns. The three patterns are the cumulative, the periodic, and the parallel sentence. We're going to talk today a little bit more about cumulative and periodic sentences. The cumulative sentence begins with the main clause and adds modifying ideas at the end, often at length. Usually when composing cumulative sentences, the most important modifying idea is placed last. You see in the cumulative sentence a more conscious arrangement of information. By placing the modifying information at the beginning of the sentence, though, and the main clause at the end, you get a periodic sentence. Periodic sentences can actually create a feeling of suspense. Here are some examples, all of them taken from a novel called Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese. It was published in 2009, and it is a wonderfully crafted story of twin brothers growing up without their birth parents in Ethiopia. It is beautifully written. Here goes. In this cumulative sentence, we have one brother describing the other. "What was completely new was this smile, which transformed my womb-mate into a blue-eyed stranger, rendering a lightness to his being, so that were it not for the sturdy female arms draped over his shoulders, caressing his hair, he would have floated off those steps." The main clause really is what was completely new was his smile. But the floating language at the end encapsulates that smile for us. That's a cumulative sentence. A periodic sentence comes when the author describes a mere villager who loves nuns so much that she wants to dress like them to emulate them. With a sash low over her brow and a crucifix as big as a revolver, she looked like a nun. That sentence always makes me laugh because the comparison of the crucifix to the revolver really is pretty startling. And then to end with, she looked like a nun, is the most startling, suspenseful part of all. Another sentence that is also an example of a periodic is this. Before I could tell if that was a smile or an expression of sadness on his face, he nodded and walked away. The emphasis on that last sentence is the fact that he's leaving. He's walking out the door. Let's take a look at that last sentence and see what we can do to play with language a little bit. Playing with language is an essential part of learning to write well. If you play with a periodic sentence and make it a cumulative sentence, or vice versa, you'll see the variety of effects that you can achieve with your writing. So we're taking this periodic sentence and we're going to reverse it. See the very different effect that's provided. He nodded and walked away before I could tell if that was a smile or an expression of sadness on his face. Really, the emphasis of that second sentence, the cumulative sentence, is on the sadness. You're really left much more with the fact that he's walking away sadly. But the first sentence, the emphasis is on the walking. In the end, playing with language, trying out those hyperboles, litotes, anaphora, and various sentence patterns will enhance your writing and enrich your audience's experience. So now it's your turn. Take a look at Journal 14 and begin to play with language.